Good morning and welcome everyone to the ABFM virtual workshop for graduate students and early career faculty in the spring 2024 semester. I am pleased to have three panelists who will be talking to us today about case-based teaching in public budgeting and finance. We have Dr. Kurt Thurmaier, Dr. Bruce McDonald, and Dr. Tatyana Guzman. Thank you for joining us. We will have kind of a panel discussion with some questions, and then we will open it up for Q&A for the audience to ask questions of our panelists. Feel free to put your questions in the chat. Sometimes I know you might forget your questions by the end of the panel discussion, so please feel free and we will get to the questions at the end of the panel discussion. So I'm going to turn it to the panelists to provide a brief introduction of themselves, and then we will start our conversation. So we'll start with Kurt and then Bruce and then Tatyana, if you could please provide just a brief introductions for the audience members who might not be familiar with you and the work that you do. Kurt, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Good morning, everyone. Kurt Thurmaier. I'm at Northern Illinois University. I'm in my end of my first year of not being an administrator since 2002. I've been teaching budgeting and finance since August of 1990. And I really got hooked on cases back in 1994 or 5 when I got sent to University of Washington for a week-long workshop with case writing and case teaching, and I've been teaching with cases ever since. It's really the perfect way to connect theory and practice.
All right, so I guess that means I'm up next. My name is Bruce McDonald. I'm on faculty at NC State University. I'm also the editor of Public Administration and the co-editor of Public Finance Journal. So Public Finance Journal, it's a new journal. We just had our first issue come out last week. I'll do my 2-second plug. It is, think of kind of science or nature, but in a public budgeting and finance, realm. It's fully open access and published by the GFOA. So if you're looking for an outlet for research, please give it a check out. I've been teaching, 14 years. It doesn't quite seem like 14 years, but prior to my academic career, I worked on the Hill for a number of years doing appropriations for members of Congress. So, if it's compared to kind of managing a classroom versus working for Congress, classroom's a whole lot easier because it's both like working with little kids all the time. And I can say that since everybody I worked for is now retired, so I don't have to worry about them hearing this and getting, upset. I started working and kind of incorporating cases into my teaching probably about 10 years ago. When I was at my first, academic position in South Bend, Indiana. They're a lot of fun. They can be, kind of stressful at times, but I think that there's a really good opportunity for using cases to help students kind of experience what things are like in the real world instead of kind of a classroom predefined setting.
Well, I guess I'm the next presenter here, and I'm Tatyana Guzman. I'm from Cleveland State University. In 1990, I think I was maybe in the middle school.
Thank you, Tatyana.
I try to remember. I try to put the dots together, and I've been with Cleveland for almost 11 years now, since I graduated Indiana University SPIA, and I taught public budgeting and finance in SPIA, and it's been almost 11 years of teaching budgeting and finance courses here at Cleveland State University. And Cleveland State University is a proud host of this year's ABFM conference. So if by some weird reason you're still not a member of ABFM, I think this is a great organization to join. Everybody has to be the member, right? And Cleveland is an excellent place to be, not only during eclipse as of yesterday, but in September, there will be no eclipse. Sorry, bad planning on my side, but but the weather is usually beautiful, and it's a great place to be together and share thoughts and ideas. So I hope to see each and every one of you at ABFM September 26, 28 of this year. The ABFM website is open, so the applications are due May 15. Please consider applying. And I hope to see you all in Cleveland in September.
Thank you. So we got a plug for a new journal. We've got a plug for the ABFM annual meeting in September, and also encouragement to, if you're not already a member of ABFM, to please join ABFM. This virtual workshop is just one of the types of activities that ABFM hosts to support our members. And this is a workshop series that is targeted primarily at graduate students and early career faculty. So with today's panel, we want to provide kind of a forum for our panelists to share their experiences with using cases to teach public budgeting and financial management, and really to offer our graduate students, early career faculty, but also people like me who might have been using cases in our classrooms but would like to do it better and would like to learn from others' experiences. So I'll start with Tatyana first, but the question for the panel is, can you share how you use cases in your public budgeting and financial management classes? And could you maybe walk us through what a class session or a topic might be where you would use case-based teaching?
Oh boy. I feel like case studies are such an important part of our teaching of public budgeting and finance. It is our subject matter is so relevant to actual life, so we have to bring these cases on a regular basis to our teaching. And I personally usually do not spend the entire class or half of the class on case study, but we use cases in the class in different settings. So we always have forums, right? In face-to-face classes, in Zoom classes, in synchronous classes, there are always forums. Some of them are run by me, some of them are run by students. I call them in the news forums. And students have to bring something that is very relevant to this week's discussion, this class discussion from recent news. And recent news, I usually ask for articles or press releases of not more than 4 or 5 years. So they initiate this discussion and they cover lots of interesting things. We just talked about property taxes. And yes, they're talking about reassessments and levies and TIFs or pilots. And I asked them to provide the discussion throughout the forum. And ask questions, right? Not just questions, do you have questions, but real questions related to the topics, related to whatever they're discussing. And with graduate students, I started sort of saving time in the class and doing this forums exclusively on Blackboard. This is the shell that we use. With undergrads, we have all these presentations in real time in the classes. So I also run these forums, right? And I bring case studies. Sometimes they're case studies from the textbook, from John Meixel's, for example, public administration, or workbook, budgeting workbook. Sometimes I bring them news pieces. Sometimes I bring them videos by, I don't know, John Oliver or NBC News. Sometimes these are newspapers articles from New York Times, from Tax Foundation, from TurboTax, whatever the topic is. I also like to show them fragments from movies when somehow a tax, for example, is on the discussion, like, sequel of Christmas Story when they discuss property taxes, or Shawshank Redemption, or The Office when they talk about budgeting. And we talk about the case, we discuss what can be done, why the situation is as is, what can be done to improve the situation. So this is sort of my ongoing experience with the students. But I do have some classes, like when we talk about benefit cost analysis in the class, I usually, instead of talking about some random virtual hypothetical project, I talk about the project, one of the projects I was involved with at some point, the Route 30, one of the highways in Ohio. So we talk about, we use that as a case study for us, right? What would be the benefits from, show them the maps and what would be the benefits of having this project? What would be the cost? And then, how do we estimate these benefits? How do we monetize expenditures and benefits? How do we estimate? How do we estimate the present value, right? Why do we do this? So sometimes I bring case studies to the class. Sometimes I bring a class to the case study, right? And it can be in different shapes and forms. For example, in fall, we met with the county officials, the county executive, the director of finance, and budget director, and other people. And I asked them to talk about specific cases. So the county was talking about the prison, right? They want to change the location of the prison and how they do it, and lots of things that you wouldn't even think about if you don't look into the specific case. Almost every spring, I take my students to Columbus to meet with the state budget officials and politicians involved in the budgeting process. And we try to do it in the heat of the budget season. So I think the absolute favorite meeting that my students, every cohort of students just loves, is the meeting with the chair of the special investigation unit of the state auditor. They always talk about this every time they bring a new story, and they talk about the timeline and how they got hints about somebody's miscompliance, right? And how they investigated the case and what happens and how much money they were able to retrieve and this and that. And we come back and we talk about the case, we talk about the experience, but so, I ask students, why do you think the situation developed this way? What internal control standards do you think were violated, right? What has to change in the, the city or the county or the school district that they're talking about to avoid the situation in the future? So we try to discuss this specific case. Yes, and sometimes, in some classes, we work on the case together. And maybe I have, one of the probably most interesting examples was, I think it was 2017. So we have two cities nearby, the suburbs of Cleveland, that have experienced fiscal emergency. One of them, some of you maybe have heard about the city of East Cleveland. It's a very interesting case. They've been in the they've been in the state of fiscal emergency for over 28 years, over the last 35, just over 35. So they came to one of our research centers and they wanted to know what to do. And there was another suburb, Maple Heights, and that was also in the case of fiscal emergency. And they come, they don't have money, and they want to know how to get out of that mess. So I organized my students in budgeting classes, and I had a group of students working on East Cleveland, a group of students working with Maple Heights, and there were 2 or 3 other groups of students looking at kind of similar suburbs of large cities that experienced fiscal emergency or bankruptcy and how they got out of the situation. That was very interesting case. We spent the semester working on that, and we had our final project presentations where the city council members from both cities, the finance directors came, the mayors of both cities came, the directors of our own research centers, my dean came. So it was very interesting, very engagement. My students were in the local newspaper, were talking about this case. And that specific class inspired actually a book that Natalia Yermasova and myself wrote about fiscal emergencies. And maybe I should show you. I'm sure many of you saw the book. Yes. And there are actually nice case studies here as well. So half of the book is more theoretical, and half of the book is other case studies of fiscal or bankruptcies and fiscal emergencies in the United States, right? Detroit, Colorado Springs, Jefferson County, Alabama. So anyway, 6 different cases, and I think it's quite interesting discussion of every one of them. Okay, I've been talking for too much. Let me switch the gears.
So we'll go to Kurt next.
Sure. So I think that I approach cases with a very clear idea about what is the theory practice connection that I want the students to get. And one of the things that John taught us was that when you go into a case, you, the instructor, need to know what are the 2-3 things that you want students to get out of this case. Because a good case is full of stuff that some of it is more important than others, and you don't want to just tell them the answer. So a good case has a lot of different things going on, and you, the instructor, choose which way you want this case. Which line do you want to develop? Which idea is most important? And part of your job as the instructor, from my perspective, is to know what the students should be getting out of this case. That also means that before you assign the case, you need to set up the theory part. So be very clear, here are the readings that I want those students to have, 2, 3, whatever, and I know how those readings inform the analysis of that case. And so I've got a couple of cases that I've used quite a bit. John Donahue taught the case workshop back then, and he had a case called the Lone Pine garbage case. And because and you can get this out of the Harvard group, but because it was used in the teaching workshop, we get to use it for free. But Lone Pine is about contracting out, for example. Okay, so I have Petoskey and Brown articles about asset specificity. I've got an Irene Rubin article about how contracting is different and so on. And the ideas here are contract management, contract capacity, the ability to have competition. And there's a distraction because in this particular case, for example, because this is a small town managed by an MPA grad, and it's in Texas, it's a bit rural, and a garbage company has been started up, and they want Lone Pine to contract with them for their garbage collection. Well, so you find out that, so the first thing they have to do is, what's the beauty about the case is the projected budget is $2,500 a deficit, just $2,500. This is really easy to fix, except students tend not to focus on that, which is the problem, right? So I really focus on all my cases on problem definition. Like for me, I tell them, your power as a management analyst is to identify the problem. Framing the problem sets up the solution set. So if someone tells you it's an economics problem, it could be a legal problem. Change the word not, eliminate the word not out of the code, and your problem is solved. No money involved, right? So framing the problem is very important. In this case, they get distracted because they have to, they want to see if they can save money by contracting for the service, right? So it's a contracting case on the one hand, but it's really just about finding $2,500 in the budget. And there's so many ways they could do this, and they would be done with the case, but no. So they have to do that. So I assign also David Ammons, and now it's Ammons and Reining, has something called go away cost analysis. And go away cost analysis is a super important way to analyze whether or not you're actually going to save money by contracting for some service. Because if you're using full cost accounting, which was a big rage back when, and you are allocating administrative costs to know what the true cost of running this program is, it doesn't mean you're going to save that cost when you contract, right? So I force my students to use the go away cost analysis, which is a very simple spreadsheet. They even show it in the chapter in the book. And so students have to do that. And they invariably, half of them get it totally wrong. 25% of them get it mostly wrong. And about 25% get it right. But it's an important concept for them that I want them to get out of this case, that the focus of the problem is actually not whether or not you save money, though I want them to learn how to analyze that. But the real issue is, how would you save? Because you don't save money, by the way. You don't save money. If you do go away cost analysis, you can't save money doing that. So now they're back to the drawing board and they have to come up with alternatives, right? So here I am setting up the readings so that the key ideas I want them to get out of this case, they read that first, and then they do the case analysis. And this is an individual case analysis where I have a clear rubric. And for my courses, 20% of the grade of a case analysis is the theory literature connection. And they have to cite at least 3 articles to support their argument, right? And with page numbers. They can't just say Petoskey and Brown say. No, show me where they say what asset specificity is, right? That kind of thing. So I'm very focused on that theory practice connection. And I think that's one mistake that people may make, is they say, oh, here's a nice case, let's talk about it. Well, what does that mean? You can talk about all kinds of things in a case. What you want to be able to know is, how are you going to get and help your students guide the conversation so they get the most important ideas out of that case. And I just finished a workshop with the Balancing Act Consortium because Franklin, Muthomi, Erica Cheka, and I have developed a couple of Balancing Act cases. And in those cases, I use group role playing. And I think group role playing in cases is a really powerful way to bring out all kinds of dynamics, but also make it more real, because you can create interest groups that are in a clash, right? They have different values, or they have different goals, and so on. And so putting those into action is also more entertaining for students. They really get in to playing the roles of the business community, or the community activists, or the city manager's office and the department heads, and so on. So I think that that's another feature. There's I just finished writing another case with the CFO for St. Charles, Bill Hanna, who teaches with us as well, for the case book that's coming out by Kim Nelson and Bob Bland for ICMA Green Book on local government cases, which has been a long time old. And that case is a capital budgeting case. And so you'll be able to use that case from that book. But Bill and I are also going to do a Balancing Act version of that case, where they can use Balancing Act to decide how to create a capital budget in general. So that'll be probably the first capital budgeting case. But the same rules apply. I know what I want my students to get out of this. I know the theory part that we have set up for this case, and you can do role playing in there as well, because there's all kinds of ways. There's allocative politics, there's technical efficiencies, all that kind of stuff. That's enough for now.
All right, Bruce, you're on deck.
All right, so there's 2 cases that I use with relative frequency, one for a budgeting class, one for a financial management class. And it really kind of depends on what the semester looks like for each particular course as to do I do full versions or do I do kind of a shortened version? So the full version on the budgeting side is where I basically bring in the police chief at the start of the semester, and the assignments throughout the semester are kind of working towards a single kind of case where it's as a scenario where the police chief is proposing or has a 5% budget cut that they have to do. But at the same time, they have to give raises to their officers. And so, how do you kind of make the choices as to where the cuts go? And it works throughout the semester because you have, everything from, trying to understand, the retirement benefits, the job requirements, that you can't lay people off, uh, aspects of budget cuts that you have to do, or cutback management, balancing budgets, understanding where the revenue streams come from that law enforcement agencies are faced with. And at different points, the chief comes back in and they're, kind of talking through the different aspects of the questions that the students have with the police chief kind of being able to give like real-time answers to those. Um, it's one of those things, it's really fun to do. I've done it once where I didn't have the police chief involved. I don't recommend that because my students started calling the police department asking what would happen if they gave cuts to the police department. And I started getting phone calls of, why are you trying to cut my budget? So if you are not going to have them involved, at least give them a heads up, and really reinforce with your students. Purely an exercise as an example, don't actually call the police chief trying to figure this out. But it works really, really nicely because it gives students the opportunity to kind of take the ideas of budgeting that we talked about in the classroom and see how they work in the real world. So, even down to defending, the recommendations of where the budget cuts would have to go. So one of the things I like to do is split the class up into several groups. Each group comes up with a different option. They present them to the police chief. The police chief kind of responds back as to what would work from their perspective and why ideas might work better than others. And then have some of the graduates of the MPA program come in the last day of the class, and the class as a whole kind of works through the full presentation of the agreed upon proposal, and they have to get it by the alumni who are coming in. So it's a lot of fun to do. It can be really, really stressful depending, of course, who your students are, because it is a semester long, kind of exercise. If I don't have a full semester, what I do is I go back. It's based off of an experience that the city of South Bend, Indiana had in 2013, where the city required the same budget cut and the same increase in salaries. And so there's a whole history of newspaper articles and documents from the city council meetings where the police chief came back and kind of said, here's what we're doing and why. And so you can use those in a singular class to go, okay, well, if you're dealing with cutback management, we can kind of see and follow through that example in real time. The back and forth that the agency with the city was kind of going through to try and figure out how do they balance that. And it works relatively nicely to kind of give that really good real world perspective that textbooks just don't quite give students in that same kind of way. And it does so under something that there's not a good answer. So, one, we like to see nice, good answers when we're dealing with stuff in our books. In the real world, the really hard questions don't have good, pretty answers. So, there is no good way to make a cut to the budget while you're also having to increase salaries. Um, and kind of trying to think through that and balance what the least critical cuts are going to be, or what might potentially work in the long run. The second, I'm gonna drop the link to the movie in the chat. It's All the Queen's Horses. It's based off Dixon, Illinois. I'm glad I went after Kirk because I kind of figured he'd end up talking about the case. I use it in my financial management class. One of the things, particularly, you're dealing with local governments or nonprofits, setting up audit constraints and knowing, being able to, um, internal controls to make sure that people aren't kind of taking advantage of the organization are difficult to begin with, and then you kind of add the complexity that most people really don't know how to do, you know, those kind of things. So what All the Queen's Horses is it's a documentary based off of a instance in Dixon, Illinois, where their finance director managed to steal, I think it was $57 million from the city before people really kind of caught on what was going on. Um, I like it for a number of reasons. One, there's free versions that you can watch of it online. So Tubi has it, uh, where you can watch it free, so the students can kind of watch it. And then you bring, you know, the discussion back into the classroom of, you know, thinking about internal controls. You know, how do we make sure that we can set up to protect an organization like a city or a county to ensure that kind of thing doesn't happen. At the same time, we can then take that similar discussion, go, well, now what would that look like if we applied it to a nonprofit? Um, and one of the things I particularly like, Dixon's not a very large town, so she was able to do it because of a smaller staff, and a lot of nonprofits particularly have very small staffs where the same person's receiving the money, who's depositing it, who's also writing the checks. And so, you know, how do you set up a constraint where you have or controls when that kind of situation's going on to ensure the responsibility that the funds are actually being utilized like they're supposed to? So it's a fairly interesting documentary. Even if you aren't using case studies, if you haven't seen it, it's worth watching because it'll blow your mind a little bit. Um, but it's a great case study. There's a couple written case study versions of Dixon, Illinois. I tend to like the movie version better. You know, the written ones you can do in, you know, 10, 15 minutes. But since you can watch the movie one, you know, online, and then they can come into the classroom, it gives a lot more depth of understanding and interviews from people of how they kind of figured and what they suspected, you know, when. Um, and as, you know, Kurt mentioned, it also really goes into a lot of the ethical kind of issues that are coming up. So, you know, it's a great resource that I use as absolutely often as I can.
And Wie, if I could add maybe a couple of things. And also, yeah, I'm listening about all these simulations and case studies. I think this is such an amazing experience. I ran, based on the class size and what I'm teaching, I ran a couple simulations as well. One is log roll, and this is actually one of John Meixel's simulations. So when I was a student, we did that, you know, when a portion of the budget had to be allocated. So we do that. And another one is the City of Camelot. I don't know if anybody is using the book, the simulation book. It is more on sort of urban issues, different urban issues, but they do have a budget simulation there. I thought it was a little bit maybe less advanced for the budgeting classes, so it was revamped. And yeah, there are different budget departments. We only spend one big class or 1 week on that if it's smaller classes, but there are different departments, and they have to put their budgets together. They have to defend the budget. They have to submit budget proposals to the central budget office, and then the city council votes for that. So kind of on a similar note, I think that's all amazing experiences.
So thank you for your answer to that question. I want to transition a little bit. You've talked already kind of about why you use cases, the benefits of it. But we also know that case-based teaching, and I put kind of in the chat the example of, you know, one of my first forays into it. I kind of did here's a case study, let's talk about it. So I'm a big proponent now of the guided structured approach to teaching using cases. But what challenges or pitfalls have you experienced in using cases, and how can they be overcome? And Bruce, we're going to start with you.
I think the biggest challenge I have, you know, since mine either has involved, you know, on the budgeting side, you know, a police chief or someone from, you know, senior positions of law enforcement kind of coming in to provide kind of that back and forth with students. You know, how do you get somebody to do that and kind of dedicate their time? You know, a lot of agencies, you know, have somebody who has an MPA, and they find it absolutely fascinating. But every now and then stuff comes up in the real world and interferes with that. And so trying to kind of manage that side is always a little bit of a challenge. The other side, as I kind of hinted at before, is when it's not that side and you're going off, kind of the more traditional, written style of case um, that the students have unfortunately called the police chief's office and asked about budget cuts. And so I've gotten a number of phone calls, despite me telling the students don't do this, from the police chief or people in the police chief's office going, "Why are you trying to cut my budget?" At one point, I had the mayor calling my department chair complaining about me for trying to cut their budget. Uh, so, the inevitability that the students are going to try and kind of, pursue an answer from other means when they can't find the answer or figure out the answer on their own or don't spend the time. And so, kind of thinking through, what that might look like or how is there a way to avoid it. I don't have a good way to avoid it because even though I insist the students don't do this, they still tend to. So a lot of the times, if I don't have somebody lined up that can come in, even at least once during the semester, uh, I tend to not use the place, example as often anymore in the class, just because of those issues having arisen. Um, Also, a lot of the things that I really wish there were case studies on, there really aren't case studies on those topics. So, there's not a whole lot of like written case studies in budget and finance. And most of the ones that there are based off of someone's experience or someone teaching a particular class. And they're awesome. But then there's, you know, issues that have come up that I'm like, I really wish there was a case study on this particular topic because it's something that's going and now that students really need to kind of see what that looks like in the real world and how to respond to it. And those case studies aren't there. And that's because just it takes a while for people to write them. And so no one's really kind of come up, to do that. I include myself in that, I would like to write some case studies and put out there for people to use, but it's a free time issue. So, accessibility and availability of case studies on the topics that we really need to have those studies on really isn't quite there all the time.
Thanks, Brute. Kurt, what about you? What are some challenges or pitfalls, and how would you recommend
Right.
that they could possibly be addressed?
Well, let me pick up on Bruce's last comment. So yes, really, we need people to write more cases in budgeting and finance. And one of the things that that when I was on the NASPA Executive Council, we really talked about the importance of getting more cases. And so we've made progress with the repository and JPay getting cases. But, and I think there's kind of a workshop, kind of a one-day thing that NASPA is starting to try out. But I think we really could use a more concerted effort to bring back the e-hallway week-long, because if you're going to write cases, you need to know how to teach cases. So that's important. And I think that's the first part, but we had like 3 days of teaching cases, and then we had 2 days of writing cases. So one of the cases that I wrote out of that workshop, I can't use anymore because I was the chair of my church finance committee back in Kansas. And like almost the first day I became finance chair, the secretary for the church said, "Oh my God, we have a big problem. One of the radiators broke, and the water poured through the ceiling, just missed my computer, which would have wiped out church records, blah, blah, blah." Well, it turns out that there's a whole bunch of these things that aren't working. I ended up as a practitioner here, right, of a nonprofit, creating a 10-year capital improvement plan for the church. So I turned that into writing that as a case, right? And the problem is now there are so many unchurched people that young folks have no clue what you're talking about when you talk about trustees, when you talk about organ consoles and all this other stuff. So I had to stop teaching the case because they're like, what is that? So I took the dialogue from that case, which I spent a lot of time on, And I just turned it into Fox Falls with Bill Hanna on the St. Charles Capital Improvement Plan. And now basically the dialogue is pretty much the same, swapped out a few things, but that's the teaching case that's set up. So, you know, getting a practitioner to help you write a case out of their experience is one way that we could get more people to write. So if you have guest lectures, right, for your budgeting class or your financial management class or whatever, and they talk about a war story, and you're like, oh, that would be an excellent thing to make sure all of my students listen to, ask them if they'd sit down with you and write a case. And, you know, I'd be happy to help with some guidance, but I think we as a field need to invest in sponsoring cases and helping people get some release time, maybe to write them, but we also need reward and regard for them. And I don't think there's a, when you write a case, we call it the scholarship of teaching, which isn't the same thing as teaching. It's the scholarship of teaching, right? So scholarship is about creating new knowledge. And so when you write a teaching case, you are creating new knowledge. It's not research in the traditional way. So part of what we have to do is advocate for reward and regards that give people full credit, because writing a teaching case is at least as hard as writing a research paper. It's not, it's really, it's complicated, and you have to get the moving parts and all this, but again, it's thinking. You have to think about, what is it that students are going to get out of this? What are the readings that I want to recommend to pull into the case, and so on. So I think JPAYS, you know, is a good place for people to start. There's an article about writing teaching cases, but you know, you can read the article and you're like, okay, that's too much work. As opposed to getting in a room with a bunch of people who want to write a case and have someone take you through the process of writing it. So I think this is one of our biggest barriers, is finding really good teaching cases in budgeting and finance. I think that's something that I'm happy that I helped get that going at NASPA, but and I think this is a, you know, this idea that that we has of putting this together is great, but I think we need to do more if we want to bring a lot of more teaching cases.
I'll throw in really quick. If you do send one to JPay for a case study, they are peer reviewed. So at least it counts as a peer reviewed publication for you.
And I think that's true in the repository too. It's peer reviewed. Unfortunately, at the moment, you have to have 2 different peer reviews. It's ridiculous.
Tatyana, do you want to kind of wrap up this question?
Yeah, sure. And I completely agree with Kurt and Bruce. This is one of my biggest challenges. There are no very few good case studies. And this is why I'm just using anything in the news to discuss a story. I don't know if anybody is using this book. It is more for undergrad students. And these are not real case studies. I mean, they're all made up, so they're not that interesting. It's still good analysis, and there are questions, you know, and there is a discussion, but they're not real world case studies. This is, yeah, a big issue. And Natalia Yermasova and I were thinking about doing maybe a book of case studies. We have a book proposal, but we haven't sent it yet. It's still, and it comes from lots of discussions with professionals, as Kurt mentioned. You start talking with them, and they all have interesting stories to tell. So over time, I feel like we all accumulate these stories. So yeah, hopefully we can put it together at some point. I need another sabbatical. But my challenge in my classes also, and I believe it's with everybody, right? I try to save time in the class. So I assign a case study to read or a video to watch to students, so that in the class we could have a discussion. And it doesn't matter how many times you remind them. It doesn't matter, you know, how many times you threaten them with sanctions. They don't read, they don't watch. Well, there is only 1 or 2 students from the entire class who did that. But I try to assign them bonus points for participation, right? So I send them 50,000 reminders to read. And well, sometimes I end up just leaving 15, 20 minutes, half an hour for them to read the case study, to know what we're talking about during the class, but it's kind of waste of time.
I can add one other thing. So the other thing to keep in mind is there really are kind of two, maybe three categories of cases. So the one kind of case is, you clip a newspaper story out of a newspaper and you turn it into a PDF and say, here, read this. And here are the three questions that we're going to discuss in class. So it's something that's already one and done, and you try to, analyze it by taking things apart and then synthesizing it, putting together with the literature and so on. So those cases are easy to find in the sense that just open the newspaper and every day there's a budgeting and finance problem at some level of government that you can use. The other kind is the kind that I prefer to teach, which is the kind that I was taught how to write, which is where you create a story that has a clear idea of what you want, and then you write the whole thing and then you cut off the end. So the students don't know the end, and it has multiple ways, multiple answers, depending on how they frame the problem in the case. And those those are the kind that you have to write, you have to create, and we have a shortage of. And that's the kind of that are important to put together. Not that other case books where here's, for example, Richard Stillman had his book on public administration cases that said, I don't know what edition it is now, but one of those cases is the Centralia mine case, which is about the failure of local. Is it getting really loud? Can you actually still hear me? The background here is terrible. It's echoing. So the idea is that that the U.S. government failed to protect the mine workers in Centralia, and some of them died because of lack of oversight. So you can take those kind of cases and you can still pull out discussion and you can still ask students to frame the problem and so on. But it's a one and done. So, but those are two different, and it really is two different ways to teach cases, to teach students with that kind versus the one where it leaves them hanging. So you can use both, and I've used both. I prefer the ones that leave them hanging, but it is a bit different depending on what kind of case you're using.
Yeah, in the same line, I've put a link in the chat to a book that Charlie Coe did in 2018, where it's the kind of a book of one and done case studies that he then links back to the different NASPA core competencies in different areas of MPA programs. So there's a chapter on financial management, kind of stories from the news from the 70s, 80s, and 2000s. They are, of course, the one and done kind of things. But, if you're looking for kind of a broad spectrum, you don't have the time to sit there and kind of sort through the news, everything. It's a great resource, that way to kind of be a crash course into a broad spectrum of stories that you can use. And he also includes the footnotes, the links of where the full stories of all the different things are. So you can always pull those for a little bit more depth of discussion in the classroom as well.
All right, thank you for those insights. We're gonna go to our last quick, just are there other pieces of advice or comments that you want to share before we open it up for questions with the audience? Tatyana, go ahead.
Maybe another piece of advice, or maybe this is a piece of advice, but I told you earlier about our books. So I actually developed the class proposal where half of the class is devoted to fiscal health and fiscal sort of illnesses, and the second half, so there are specific lectures. There are 15 chapters in the book, so it is a very convenient sort of 16-week course, like a semester-long course. So if anybody's interested, I'd be happy to share the syllabus. I haven't taught the class myself, but it was approved by the faculty. So every week covers different topics, and 6 weeks are devoted to individual case studies from the book. And then in the end of the course, students have to, throughout the course, students have to develop a project where they have to study a fiscally ill municipality, and I provide suggestions of where to look for, which municipality to use, and then based on what they learned in the class, in the last assignment or the course project is to discuss why municipality got into the situation, what happened, how the situation developed, and how to get out of that mess. So if anybody's interested, please contact me. I'd be happy to share my
Why
sample.
don't you
Thanks,
just put the
Tatyana.
link in the chat, Tatyana?
Sure, with my email. Yeah.
Yeah, put your email in the chat and people can email you if they want that syllabus.
Yeah.
Other comments? Thoughts, additional thoughts? Well, if not, I'd like to open it up for the audience. If you have specific questions, please feel free to unmute and ask your question, or you can type it in the chat. This is the opportunity to get some additional insights from our 3 panelists. Dan, go ahead.
Hey there, thank you all for your wisdom. Just kind of thinking of bringing this into some of the modern paradigms we're dealing with. Any wisdom regarding maybe Zoom courses or asynchronous online?
Sure. So I teach the same cases online, asynchronous as well as classroom. And in the case that's been accepted in JPay, there's an online version and a schedule as online as a classroom. And the difference is how you would pace the conversation because you can still do role plays with an asynchronous online course. We are an 8-week format program, so that is a constraint. It's not 16 weeks, but I think it's all as in most of teaching for me online versus it's how do you engage the students in the cases, and having very clear idea about what you want them to get out of it is a way for you to make sure you guide that discussion in the discussion board. We require some video presentations for them, so they have to use a Zoom recording or a crappy Kaltura program or whatever it is to make a video recording of their presentation to the city council or whatever that is. And I think the videos, especially group videos, are a great way to make sure that the online asynchronous folks are actually collaborating together offline, and then bringing it together for presentation.
Yeah, then, so the class I was just talking about, based on our book, it was developed as a synchronous online class. And the forums that I was talking about, they work perfectly in any class settings. If it is in a synchronous class, I post the forums and questions, and students sign up on wikis, for participation in this online forums. So there is a student forum run by students. There is a forum run by me. I give them lots of points for like insane amount of maybe 20% of the class or something like that is based on participation, right, on online forums. If it is a face-to-face class, I give students 5% bonus towards the entire class for participation. So this works pretty well usually. And the log roll simulation I was talking about, unfortunately, I don't have it. Maybe I should organize and print it because I still have this old, like printouts from Mike's class from 15 years ago or so. But I was a little bit worried about how to go with it when we all moved to Zoom. And I divide students or participants by breaking rooms, and it's been much better than in face-to-face presentations. They get so heated up, they get out of that, they defend their budgets with so fiercely it is amazing. And they all tell me, we never thought that budgeting can be so exciting. Okay, I guess that's the point. So it's working.
Other responses to that question? So I think, Dan, the conclusion is that it's doable. It might require a different way of thinking about it, but we actually might be surprised at the outcome of teaching cases in those types of environments.
I think with the online forum, I found that in the discussion threads, breaking them down into smaller groups and having very focused questions about the cases has been useful for me. So that, and what I ask, so I don't want my threads to grow forever. I want them to be tight and focused. So I ask each group to just focus on one of the starter questions that I give them instead of trying to do everything.
Thank you all so much for joining us. And I hope to see some of you at the ABFM meeting in September.
Everybody. Everybody, see you in Cleveland. We're preparing.
Thank you so much, everyone.